lot of people are being killed. The world economy is being wrecked. Those two sentences, blunt and unadorned, have become a kind of refrain in conversations about the conflict set that is rapidly redrawing international fault lines. They are the opening alarm from voices across the political spectrum, scholars, former officials, and commentators who see the same terrifying pattern. What began as localized strikes and reprisals is unspooling into something far wider and far more dangerous, and the instruments of statecraft meant to contain violence are creaking at the seams. One commentator put it even more sharply. Listening to Trump makes it clear that he is both incompetent and utterly mentally unstable. I'm sorry to say, whether you agree with that judgment or not, the underlying fear is clear and quantifiable. Political leadership is being judged not merely on policy, but on temperament. Decisions once argued about in strategy rooms and ministries of defense are now on full B. NG in public on a political stage where rhetoric can become policy and rhetoric can trigger military responses. The stakes could not be higher. Human lives, global markets, and the fragile mechanisms of international order are all at risk. That same voice did not hold back on characterizing the broader choices that led to this moment. This is not a good situation, they said, describing war that has been, in their words, lawless, reckless, and destructive. They accused key leaders of overreach and of pursuing strategies that were built on wishful thinking, the belief that a military operation could be a one-day affair, that strikes could be limited and effects contained. When the plan fails to match reality, escalation becomes the default posture. The result is an increasingly brutal conflict that spreads outward, strikes on Iran, incursions into Lebanon, and an expanding cast of actors now engaged in episodic or sustained hostilities. What is driving this escalation? One repeat de-diagnosis speaks to personality as much as to policy. He himself is a narcissistic megalomaniac, the critic said, invoking a portrait of power driven by ego and spectacle. They described a leader who speaks in tones foreign to recent American presidential histories, vulgarity, brutality, and what they called psychopathy, a leader they warned who seems to believe he can act with impunity and that the rules that have governed state behavior no longer apply. Whether one accepts that psychological profile or not, the operational consequence is the same. Actions and threats that appear untethered from long-term strategy and a diplomatic apparatus that seems reluctant or unable to check those impulsionality, motives, and ambitions matter. The critic argued that regional actors are playing familiar games of control and influence. Israel wants to run the Middle East. The United States wants to run the world. When these ambitions meet miscalculation, the result is not subtle. What was intended in some minds as decisive pressure became a cascade of violent responses. They thought this would be a one-day operation, the commentator said, and when it did not end quickly, the choice became to double down. More strikes, broader targets, deeper involvement by allies and proxies. One prominent economist has warned that the military option is especially perilous. He urged caution, arguing that if conventional bombing resumes on a larger scale, the next round of retaliation will not be confined to traditional battlefields. We should be avoiding a return to outright bombing, he said bluntly. If strikes resume, Iran will respond and respond hard. Those are not rhetorical flourishes. They are strategic forecasts rooted in recent history and in an appreciation of the interconnectedness of modern infrastructure. Oil and gas facilities, ports and desalination plants, the arteries of regional economies are vulnerable in ways states have not fully protected for war. Damage to these nodes would ripple outward, raising energy prices, disrupting shipping, and threatening the water supplies and livelihoods of millions. The economist's caution also extended to defensive systems themselves. Missile defenses, while politically reassuring, are imperfect and resource-intensive. Recent fighting, he argued, has shown that anti-missile systems are not impenetrable. Munitions, salvos, and creative targeting of infrastructure can strain or even deplete defensive capacities. If those defenses fail at scale, the damage will not be restricted to military targets. Critical economic corridors and maritime choke points could be affected, and the geopolitical arithmetic shifts when commerce is imperiled and civilian suffering mounts. That is why this is not merely a regional problem. Once a conflict crosses multiple fronts, airspace, sea lanes, ports, pipelines, and even cyberspace, it stops being a localized confrontation. It becomes a system-wide shock with global consequences. The economists warned that a return to broad bombing runs could trigger a chain reaction across bases, trade routes, and energy corridors. A blow to a desalination plant or a petroleum terminal in the Gulf can mean cascading humanitarian crises for countries that rely on imported water or fuel. A sustained disruption of shipping in key choke points drives costs up for the entire world economy. Markets that were stabilizing after pandemic-era disruptions would be shaken again. In Washington, debate has hardened along familiar fault lines. Those who argue that military pressure creates leverage and those who insist it only increases risk. The answer, according to some analysts, is increasingly clear. Leverage has a price, and the price may be one the world is ill-prepared to pay. Resuming or ramping up strikes could produce short-term tactical gains, but with strategic costs that include the depletion of defensive capability, the galvanization of adversary coalitions, and an emboldened set of non-state actors willing to exploit any opening. This is not abstract. The practical manifestations are already visible. Incidents at sea have escalated, attacks on energy infrastructure have been reported, and regional militias and insurgent groups from Lebanon to Yemen have tested the reach of new alignments. The Houthis, for example, have shown the capacity to strike at maritime targets and have signaled a willingness to enter the fray. Whether those interventions are decisive or episodic, they expand the battlefield and complicate the calculus for states trying to limit damage. At the same time, domestic politics in key capitals are shaping what actions are possible. Leadership styles, political coalitions, and public messaging all filter into military choices. One commentator lamented the absence of adults in the room. We don't have too many grown-ups in the room. Almost nobody dares to speak the truth about this disastrous situation. And I think it is escalating. That observation, bitter and urgent, captures a wider frustration. Institutions designed to temper impulse and weigh consequence are under strain, and when they falter, political theater can become policy. This matters for ordinary people in the United States and around the world. War is not merely the domain of generals and diplomats. It is a force that reshapes markets, disrupts supply chains, and threatens the daily essentials of food, fuel, and water. The global economy is not isolated from geopolitics. It is deeply entangled with it. So when economic commentators warn that the world economy is being wrecked, they are describing a real and measurable risk. Higher prices for energy and commodities, slower growth, and increased volatility that hits the most vulnerable hardest. And yet, amid the fear and the warnings, there is a competing narrative, a quieter set of efforts to build back the channels that can restrain violence. Diplomacy, quiet negotiations, third-party mediation, and emergency humanitarian planning are not headlines the way missile strikes are, but they are the instruments that can avert escalation. Some actors are quietly pressing for negotiations with neighboring states. Others are working to secure critical infrastructure and maintain the flow of commerce. Those actions are less glamorous, but they are essential. There is another angle to this global story. While much of the world watches the drama in West Asia, other strategic realignments continue apace. Trade negotiations, regional economic cooperation, and the long-term movement of supply chains are shifting the balance of economic influence. In some capitals, leaders are recalibrating alliances and investments to reflect a multipolar reality where the United States is an indispensable actor, but not the only one shaping outcomes. That dynamic matters because it gives countries options other than alignment by force. Economic cooperation can be an alternate route to influence, and for some states, it is becoming the preferred route. Amid all of this, rhetoric matters. Public speeches, televised interviews, and social media posts can escalate or de-escalate tensions. The language of domination and the language of restraint produce different political climates. One commentator described the rhetoric on display as megalomania built on normal American exceptionalism, warning that when rhetoric and policy align in a bellicose direction, the risk of miscalculation rises. The same critic predicted that as long as much of the world remains passive, treating conflict like a spectator sport, escalation will continue to be the path of least resistance. That is an indictment not just of leaders, but of publics and institutions that have become accustomed to consuming crisis rather than responding to it. A prominent economist framed the immediate choice in stark terms: avoid renewed bombing and seek containment and diplomacy, or risk a spiral that could cross multiple fronts and produce outcomes none of the principal actors want. Once a conflict begins crossing multiple fronts, he warned, it may stop being just a Middle East war. The implication is unambiguous. Containment is not merely desirable, it is essential to prevent strategic conflagration. Still, even as analysts and critics issue these warnings, the instruments of escalation remain at hand. Military planners refine their options, political leaders test public tolerance, and non-state actors exploit openings. The result is a dangerous feedback loop. Action begets response. Response begets further action. Breaking that loop requires political will, diplomatic creativity, and a readiness to accept difficult compromises. It also requires a public willing to insist on strategies that preserve life and livelihood rather than triumphal gestures that risk everything. There are finally human stories behind the strategic language. When analysts speak of wounded economists, ease and damaged infrastructure, what they describe are families losing access to clean water, workers finding their livelihoods disrupted, and communities facing the prospect of protracted recovery. The human cost of escalation is immediate and long-lasting, and it is the moral argument for restraint that many observers keep returning to. A promotional segment for an international news series put it in a single phrase: everything, everywhere, all at once. That slightly breathless line captures what is at stake. We live in an age of interdependence where violence in one place can cascade across continents and into boardrooms, ports, and homes. The choice before leaders and publics is whether to treat that interdependence as a reason for restraint or as a pretext for unilateral action. As this drama unfolds, it is worth remembering a simple test for policy. Does this action make the world safer for ordinary people, or does it increase their risk? Does it secure long-term stability, or does it buy a short-term illusion of strength at the cost of broader ruin? These are the questions that some critics argue are not being asked loudly enough. The coming days and weeks will matter. Whether the violence is contained or escalates will depend on decisions in capitals, on the willingness of intermediaries to broker pauses, and on the capacity of institutions, both national and international, to hold. It will also depend on public pressure and on whether citizens insist that their leaders choose diplomacy over spectacle. The alarms are sounding. The warnings are urgent, and in rooms where policy is discussed in private, the calculus is brutally clear. The costs of miscalculation are now measured in lives and in the stability of a global economy that millions depend upon. The choice is ours collectively to press for a course that returns us from the brink toward diplomacy, protection of civilians, and the rebuilding of channels that can prevent one mistaken act from becoming a wider war.